This is English for Maturità. Welcome to today's episode of English for Maturità. I am Mrs. Gallio, aka TheProffa, and I hope to help you revise for your final exam. You'll find all info in the description of this podcast. Enjoy this episode. So, why study the portrait of Dorian Gray? Wilde wrote a million other stories, plays as well, like, for example, An Ideal Husband or The Importance of Being Earnest, which are a million times more entertaining than the portrait. But if we consider the time, the age when the portrait was written, then everything becomes clearer. First of all, Dorian Gray is a nice, dark story, so it's relatable also for younger learners, because we all like a bit of horror, don't we? And in the end, Dorian Gray is something of a horror story. And the atmosphere is very dark. Dorian does not just move in the world of the upper class, but he also goes into the slums, into poor London, and he has relations with people who do not belong to his same class. And he also commits murders. He kills people. Well, what's not to like in a killer? This is very popular today, isn't it? And then there is something else that the audience of the time must have loved, and that we also tend to like, which is the cycle of sin and redemption. So that what Dorian does, which is aim at immortal beauty and living forever, is actually wrong. And since it is wrong because it goes against nature, it must be punished. And if you think about it, this connects with a number of other works of the 19th century. Like Frankenstein, although Frankenstein was not written in the Victorian age, because it was written in 1818. But there is also a very close parallel to The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Stevenson, where Dr. Jekyll, or Mr. Hyde, ultimately has to die so that Mr. Hyde is not unleashed onto the world, because Mr. Hyde is pure evil. And so he commits suicide. And it's more or less the same thing that Dorian does when he stabs the portrait in the passage where where the author describes the death of Dorian, which I'm going to read at the end of this podcast. And so yes, there's that, and that cycle of sin and redemption must have been punishment after sin. You don't get to live forever and be beautiful forever. You have to die. You don't. You simply don't. And that is the message. You don't go against nature. So that we have that. And the themes themselves of youth and beauty, which are still very modern today, things that we see all the time on social media or wherever you want, were very popular back then. And so that is why this work is still worth a read. And last but not least, there is something else that connects Wilde's work with other works of the time, like Jekyll, like Frankenstein, which is the theme of the double. Dorian and the portrait are the double of each other. Dorian stays young and beautiful, the portrait ages and becomes old and ugly and horrible in his place. But there is something else which is also a good tie in with Stevenson's work, which is the contrast between rich London and poor London. And it's more or less the same when in Dr. Jekyll we see the front of the house, of Dr. Jekyll's house, which is beautiful, and the back street, which is definitely not. Or London and Edinburgh both have good sides, bad sides, rich sides, poor sides. And this ambivalence, this ambiguity, this being double, is a characteristic of the Victorian age. And now for some reading, I am going to read the final part of The Portrait of Dorian Gray. From The Portrait of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. A new life, that was what he wanted. That was what he was waiting for. Surely he had begun it already. He had spared one innocent thing at any rate. He would never again tempt innocence. He would be good. As he thought of Hetty Merton, he began to wonder if the portrait in the locked room had changed. Surely it was not still so horrible as it had been. Perhaps, if his life became pure, he would be able to expel every sign of evil passion from the face. Perhaps the signs of evil had already gone away. He would go and look. He took the lamp from the table and crept upstairs. As he unbarred the door, a smile of joy flitted across his strangely young-looking face and lingered for a moment about his lips. Yes, he would be good, and the hideous thing that he had hidden away would no longer be a terror to him. He felt as if the load had been lifted from him already. He went in quietly, locking the door behind him, as was his custom, and dragged the purple hanging from the portrait. A cry of pain and indignation broke from him. He could see no change, save that in the eyes there was a look of cunning, and in the mouth the curved wrinkle of the hypocrite. The thing was still loathsome, more loathsome if possible than before, and the scarlet dew that spotted the hand seemed brighter and more like blood newly spilled. Then he trembled. Had it been merely vanity that had made him do his one good deed, or the desire for a new sensation, as Lord Henry had hinted with his mocking laugh, or that passion to act a part that sometimes makes us do things finer than we are ourselves, or perhaps all of these? And why was the red stain larger than it had been? It seemed to have crept like a horrible disease over the wrinkled fingers. There was blood on the painted feet, as though the thing had dripped, blood even on the hand that had not held the knife. Confess? Did it mean that he was to confess? To give himself up and be put to death? He laughed. He felt that the idea was monstrous. Besides, even if he did confess, who would believe him? There was no trace of the murdered man anywhere. Everything belonging to him had been destroyed. He himself had burned what had been below stairs. The world would simply say that he was mad. They would shut him up if he persisted in his story. Yet it was his duty to confess, to suffer public shame, and to make public atonement. There was a God who called upon men to tell their sins to earth as well as to heaven. Nothing that he could do would cleanse him till he had told his own sin. His sin? He shrugged his shoulders. The deaths of Basil Hallward seemed very little to him. He was thinking of Hetty Merton, for it was an unjust mirror, this mirror of his soul that he was looking at. Vanity, curiosity, hypocrisy. Had there been nothing more in his renunciation than that? There had been something more. At least he thought so, but who could tell? No, there had been nothing more. Through vanity he had spared her. In hypocrisy he had worn the mask of goodness. For curiosity's sake he had tried the denial of self. He recognized that now. But this murder, was it to dog him all his life? Was he always to be burdened by his past? Was he really to confess? Never. That was only one bit of evidence left against him. The picture itself, that was evidence. He would destroy it. Why had he kept it so long? Once it had given him pleasure to watch it changing and growing old. Of late he had felt no such pleasure. It had kept him awake at night. When he had been away, He had been filled with terror lest other eyes should look upon it. It had brought melancholy across his passions. Its mere memory had marred many moments of joy. It had been like conscience to him. Yes, it had been conscience. He would destroy it. He looked round and saw the knife that had stabbed Basil Hallward. He had cleaned it many times till there was no stain left upon it. It was bright and glistened. As it had killed the painter, so it would kill the painter's work, and all that that meant. It would kill the past, and when that was dead, he would be free. It would kill this monstrous soul life, and without its hideous warnings, he would be at peace. He seized the thing and stabbed the picture with it. There was a cry heard, and a crash. The cry was so horrible in its agony that the frightened servants woke and crept out of the rooms. 2 gentlemen who were passing in the square below stopped and looked up at the great house. They walked on till they met a policeman and brought him back. The man rang the bell several times, but there was no answer. Except for a light in one of the top windows, the house was all dark. After a time he went away and stood in an adjoining portico and watched. "Whose house is that, constable?" asked the elder of the 2 gentlemen. "Mr. Dorian Gray's, sir," answered the policeman. They looked at each other as they walked away and sneered. One of them was Sir Henry Ashton's uncle. Inside, in the servants' part of the house, the half-clad domestics were talking in low whispers to each other. Old Mrs. Leaf was crying and wringing her hands. Francis was as pale as death. After about a quarter of an hour, he got the coachman and one of the footmen and crept up the stairs. They knocked, but there was no reply. They called out. Everything was still. Finally, after vainly trying to force the door, they got on the roof and dropped down onto the balcony. The windows yielded easily. Their bolts were old. When they entered, they found hanging upon the wall a splendid portrait of their master as they had last seen him, in all the wonder of his exquisite youth and beauty. Lying on the floor was a dead man, in evening dress, with a knife in his heart. He was withered, wrinkled, and loathsome of visage. It was not till they had examined the rings that they recognized who he was. Thank you for listening to my podcast, and I wish you smooth sailing for your exam. And if you have any suggestions for future episodes, please just write me at the email you'll find in the description. Have a good day. Bye.